Hello everybody and welcome to the third Community Network webinar of the year. We are talking all about river health and testing today, and we've got Darren and David here, the experts in our field. So would you guys like to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, I'm Darren Tansley. I work for Essex Wildlife Trust as the Wilder Rivers and Protected Species Manager. So I do a lot of river restoration work, species reintroductions, all sorts of things to do with rivers at a sort of local and county and regional level, really.
Hi, I'm David Findley. I'm part of the Deben Climate Centre, and I run the Deben Water Quality Group, who are testing and environmentally looking at the River Deben and its catchment. I'll be saying more about that later.
Thank you both. Perfect. So we're going to get straight into presentations, and then there will be a chance for Q&A at the end. So please do pop any questions that you have in the chat, and we will come to them at the end.
Great, thank you. This is a sort of cut down version of a talk that I do called A Brief Unnatural History of Rivers, and it's really looking at the state of our rivers, how they've become what they are, how can they be resilient against climate change. So I'm going to cover the sort of broad brush before David really dives into the nitty gritty and the detail of what you need to know about a local river and you know, the sort of testing and various other things that the community are doing there. But it's always useful to start with something basic. What is a river? I think we probably all think we know what a river is, but what we don't realise is that the sort of rivers that we get now in certainly in lowland England are not like these sort of meandering channels which just move across the floodplain and they're changing course every year. This is how rivers used to be, and over the centuries we've kind of tamed the rivers and turned them into something slightly different, which I think is probably what we would recognise as a normal river, a sort of channel winding its way through the countryside. You could map this quite easily on an ordnance survey map and it wouldn't change from year to year. That wouldn't have been the case with a natural river in the past. The river channel could have changed in myriad ways just over one single winter, with channels changing and meandering around and a whole range of different water courses across what we would now call the floodplain. So we have a sort of fixed view of what a river is, and when we see it do this, we just think, oh, flooding, terrible, terrifying prospect. This really is just the winter channel of the river. This is what a river should be doing. It flows across the whole of that area during the winter, and then it starts to fall back into smaller channels during the summers. This is a natural cycle. So I would call that the river, and the channel that we call the river now something quite unnatural. So there have been many things that have been happening to our rivers over the years. We've started to pull stuff out of the rivers, you know, any kind of debris like trees, branches and things that we find in there, we pull out. We straighten the channels out so that they flow quicker and we can drain the water away faster because we feel that will help with flooding. We put drains all over our roads, and you know, these gully pots like the one that you can see in the corner there, they don't go to a treatment work, they go straight into your river. So if anybody pours anything down those, it goes straight into your local river or stream. So these are quite dangerous things to pour chemicals down, and certainly a lot of road runoff goes down those drain pots and into our rivers and contains some pretty nasty stuff. So this is the sort of new normal, really. We start to create these channels which are really not meandering in the way that they should, not changing across the seasons, and they're just locked into these straight channels where the water will flow sluggishly maybe through the summer, but then suddenly charge down the river over winter. Now, it's important to realise this is not something that's happened recently. Look at this disastrous scene here. We've got very little floodplain woodland. There's choking of the river gravels where the fish would normally spawn because there's a sediment going into the river where it's been widened for access, and poaching, which is the sort of trampling down of the banks. I mean, what a nightmare. And really, don't get me started on this piece of industrial destruction, you know, where the river has actually been straightened out. There's a barrier there to stop fish moving up and down. It's perched up high above where it should be able to flow. I mean, obviously, I'm joking a little bit about these Constable paintings because they're the sort of our idyllic, bucolic version of the countryside. But in fact, already by his day, the rivers had been extremely changed from what a natural river would be, and this just sort of illustrates that type of change over the years. So, how much water do we actually have in our rivers? Well, this is the River Chelmer, two very different photographs here. Now, you may think, what has happened to the river in that top photograph? The River Chelmer, as it flows through near Chelmsford at the Army and Navy bypass, is a very large river in Essex, and probably very similar to the sorts of rivers that we'll find across Suffolk and Essex and Norfolk. Wide channel, lots of water in there. But there is a barrier at this point, a barrier that was erected by the Environment Agency. It's a kind of flood defence barrier, and it actually impounds the water behind it. So the water builds up behind this barrier like a dam. And when that gate was removed for maintenance, the water level dropped down to the level that you can see there. And that is the natural flow of water down the River Chelmer, one of the largest rivers in Essex. And you can see there's very little water flowing down that river. Our rivers are actually divided up into a sequence of what you could think of as linear lakes behind barriers, things like weirs, mill gates, flood defence constructions. All of these block the river, they dam the river, and the water backs up behind it to a level which is totally unnatural. So our rivers are actually at high capacity, those river channels are at high capacity already when flood water comes down the river catchment. But the flow is very small. So if you have a look next time you're out and you go, say, visit a mill, say Deben Mill, and you look at the actual amount of water that comes over the top of the gate at the mill, it's actually quite small. And that's the flow of the water. Forget the actual water that's backed up behind it, because that's literally just impounded water. So we have a very unnatural view of what our rivers are anyway. They're absolutely wildlife arteries across the countryside. You know, without rivers, we would lose many rare and endangered species, and many species that rely on that water course as their only home, including other ones that will utilize it from time to time, especially for drinking water. But aquatic insects, for instance, which have a life cycle which is partly below the water and then partly above it, absolutely must have that connection in the river channel. And that comes from things like woody debris in the channel, or emergent plants that actually grow out of the water and allow those insects to climb up the stems, emerge, pupate, and then enter their adult life cycle. So a really vibrant and important habitat across the whole of our region. And our rivers are facing unprecedented challenges now. Pollution is one that's particularly, I would say, since about 1965, plastic has been found in the ocean in ever increasing quantities, and now it's got to an epidemic level. Plastic enters our rivers, travels downstream, and ends up out in the ocean. Some of this will wash up along our shorelines, but much of it will go out to sea. And we are already noticing this in animals that we're monitoring on the rivers. So otters are one of those species that's recovered over the last 30 to 40 years. They're now widespread across East Anglia, and they're eating all sorts of fish and small mammals, birds, all sorts of things, but mostly fish. But when we examine the droppings of otters, we've started to find these little plastic balls inside the sprains, the droppings of the otter. Now that's a 1 millimeter grid there. So you can see these are tiny, and these are and nurdles. These are the little bits of plastic that are used as the base components for manufacturing plastic items. So these would be melted down, and then they'll create part of your smartphone or your car or whatever it is that we're using them for. So they're getting into the food chain somehow, along with other microplastics, and otters are eating that. And it's quite possible that these have been eaten by fish maybe first, and then the otter has eaten the fish, and that's how it's gone into the system. But even animals as small as a water shrew, which is around about the size of a mole, but it's an aquatic shrew, so it dives underwater, it hunts underwater for small crustacea and insects. We've examined the scats of these, which, the scat is only 2 millimeters long, and you can see there that we found a piece of hexagonal plastic inside one of these scats, and you can see it highlighted there against the tip of a ballpoint pen. This is tiny. This is a tiny fragment that you would not be able to see with the naked eye. You'd have to see it under a microscope. So this plastic is flowing freely into our watercourses and being ingested by animals, and this will inevitably have some kind of knock-on effect. Other challenges, pollution, and I'm sure that David will speak much more ably about this than I will now, but just to give you an idea of what's going on, sewage is entering our rivers. We know this is happening because the Rivers Trust have an excellent website where you can actually have a look and see all of the spills, sewage spills that are going on. So this is the county I work in, Essex, and this is 1 year of sewage spills, raw sewage into our rivers. Much of it licensed and allowable in law. Some instance where it's an overspill during flooding. This looks like a measles outbreak. There are so many spills going into our rivers. Again, this is having an impact, and David will explain more about that. Non-native species are another issue that we have to deal with in all environments. This is not limited to the aquatic environments. It's not just our rivers that are struggling, but of course rivers will struggle because they're a limited size of habitat. And if you get something like the photograph here of floating pennywort that gets into a watercourse, it can quickly engulf the whole thing, and then you've got no light going into the water, so anything that needs light below the water surface is struggling, and even birds as large as swans find it difficult to be able to make their way through this sort of infestation of a plant that's really escaped from our garden ponds and into the wild. It's not the only invasive that's a problem. We declared our native white-clawed crayfish extinct in Essex in 2022. Very sad day indeed when we lost the last colony due to signal crayfish, which are American, much larger predatory crayfish. They carry a crayfish plague which wipes out the white-clawed crayfish. And these were deliberately introduced into our rivers for the restaurant trade. People thought, we'll harvest them and sell them on, and they soon spread and caused devastation along our rivers. So another pretty nasty thing to have out there in our watercourses. Some cause problems for us too. Giant hogweed, for instance, which was introduced in the late 1800s as an ornamental plant, but has a terrifying consequence that if you get the sap on your skin, causes burning sensation and can photosynthesize sensitize your skin, probably for life, to be perfectly honest. This causes horrible burns and welts to break out when sunlight goes on the infected area. So it's a really nasty plant that grows up to 5 meters tall in one season. This is a huge plant. It looks prehistoric. And again, this is one that we are doing our best to remove from the environment, just due to the fact that it will be prolific if it gets away. Those seeds heads can be 0.5 meter across, and they're going to have hundreds and hundreds of seeds in them. So a pretty nasty one, that. Himalayan balsam, again, not necessarily harmful to us, but ironically harmful to fish. And you might not believe that because it grows on the banks. It's not actually doing anything in the channel itself, but it has this property where at the sign of the first frost, it dies off. So it grows prolifically and shades out all of our native plants along a riverbank. It just completely dominates, then dies back, and all you're left with is bare soil at exactly the time of year when the rains are at their worst and washing silt and sediment off the banks, the now bare banks, and into the river. And this chokes the gravels where the fish spawn and where the invertebrates that they feed on live. And so it has this detrimental knock-on effect to our fish populations, which you wouldn't necessarily know looking at it on the riverbank. Likewise, another problem for our rivers is this connectivity issue. The fact that I mentioned barriers in the water that back up the water, well, they not only do that, but they also prevent fish from being able to move upstream past those barriers. So even something as relatively small as that weir there can be enough to stop most fish species from being able to swim past it and upstream. And certainly the one on the left, which is up to 1.5 meters high, there's no way anything can jump over that. So suddenly we've got all of these obstructions for fish being able to actually move up and downstream. Now, you may think of mills as being beautiful structures, and they are. They're some of the most beautiful points along our rivers, and we cherish them for their heritage value and the look of those structures. But those mill gates are a barrier, a definite barrier to fish migration. Again, if you look from one side of a mill gate to the other, you'll often see a drop of 2 to 3 meters, and that's a water level drop that is impossible for fish to be able to navigate. And yet we probably, as human beings, don't really see these as a problem. We don't really think of it when we look at them. It's almost a hidden issue. Whereas if we see a tree go into a river, suddenly we're panicking, and it's going to be a massive flood issue, and we've got to get it out as quickly as possible. If we look more closely, when we do see something like this go into the water, you will notice that the water is still flowing through it, and it's flowing at the same level. You will see changes in water flow because as it hits the wood, it may churn around. It may create some areas where gravels and sediment start to build up, and other places where they're being thrown down by faster water flows. So you get a very dynamic sort of riverbed with lots of different types of little niches for wildlife to get into. But actually, the flood risk to these is minimal in comparison to damming the river with a barrier, a man-made barrier. So this is a natural part of our river and actually essential for fish and other invertebrates. There's over 150 aquatic invertebrates that rely on wood in our rivers for their survival. So it's an important habitat, microhabitat in our rivers. These are the sorts of species that really thrive when you've got wood in the channel. Things like mayflies, dragonflies. These invertebrates that have most of their life cycle under the water as a predatory larva, and then when they're ready to migrate to their adult stage, they will climb out of the water, and they'll often use that woody debris to get up and out of the water. And also that woody debris is providing a lot of other benefits for other species. Fish really do live in trees. You will see fish inside these havens and protective havens, really, because the wood is so complex under the water with these branches that predators like otters find it really difficult to get in there. So the fish tend to sort of shoal around in these tree lines under the water. And if you visit a river and walk it and see this, sort of something down in the water like that, 9 times out of 10, that's where you'll find your fish. And the rest of the walk, you might not see many at all. They're just too exposed. So it's a great habitat. It also creates this diversity of light and temperature. Now, as climate change takes hold, the summers are getting warmer. we're also entering drought periods where the water levels are lower, and that increases the water temperature. The water temperatures in our rivers are going up and up, and there comes a stage where fish species cannot survive the temperatures that the water is getting to, and it will be different for different species, so some will die off first. But if we can allow them to have these areas of cool water, deeper water as well, where the water churns up, then at least they've got refuges to be able to get to survive this sort of change in our climate. Because we do know, regardless of whether you believe climate change is human induced or not, we do know we are going through a period of extreme volatility where temperature is changing, water availability is changing. We're seeing a boom and bust in our water cycle of too much water at some stage, not enough at another. And this can be a tragic consequence of what is happening with this sort of boom and bust. When we get these major flash floods through, and culverts and other barriers, bridges and bits and pieces like that cross the river, the water rises up over them. Otters try to cross the road instead of going underneath, and they get knocked down. And we see it every year in Essex. I've collected about 15 dead otters off our roads this year alone when the floods happened. So it's a yearly cycle now. We have, as I say, a boom and bust. Both of these photographs taken in Essex are one of a river that's completely dried up, just no water left, and another one where it's spilt out onto the roads, and we're used to seeing that. And the animals are trying to respond to this situation, but it can be really difficult, because as we get these flash floods in the summer now, rather than just high water levels in the winter, that coincides with exactly the time when species like kingfishers or water voles are breeding, and they breed in our riverbanks. They're usually in holes, burrows, tunnels, and those soon get flooded if the water levels rise over the top of the bank during the summer. And obviously those young ones inside are particularly vulnerable and will drown, and have drowned along our rivers during summer floods. Interestingly, water voles on the River Cone in 2012, when we did have an awful lot of summer flooding, started to plug the burrow entrances to try to stop the floodwater getting into their burrows and drowning their young ones. So they were basically doing exactly what we do. They were sandbagging their home to try to stop the floodwater getting in. And it's just incredible to think that these rodents are actually trying their best to adapt to this climate change that we're suffering at the moment. So we must get away from this idea that we've got to drain everything as soon as possible, because what we're doing is we're actually flushing soil and water out to sea as fast as we can. It seems to be an absolute obsession of human beings to rid ourselves of what are the two most valuable resources for our lives and the lives of biodiversity. So we will see scenes like this with gullying and sediment running off bare fields. That goes into the rivers. That is again causing problems with sedimentation for fish. We've removed a lot of the hedgerows as well, so we're not holding the soil on the land anymore. Our solutions always seem to be dredge it, make the channel again straighter and deeper. I've already explained the channels are so impounded that it doesn't actually matter how deep you make the channel, because the water is just going to back up behind the next barrier downstream anyway. So you're not actually creating a huge amount of extra capacity by doing that, but you're also destroying a huge amount of habitat in the process. And you're also finding that these channels, if they're straightened out, there's less channel. A meandering channel is much longer with greater capacity than a straight channel. So you're actually doing disservice to drainage really and flood relief by straightening a channel out. So we then reach for the engineering tool, and this is a flood barrier that was created for the Cobbins Brook in South Essex. Now this brook is about 2 to 3 meters wide at most, so 5 or 6 feet wide most of the brook, and we've built this massive barrier to try to avoid flooding in the downstream area, when what we should be doing is trying to naturally stop the amount of water flushing through that system as fast as it does. So I mean, we do we do reach for the sledgehammer to crack the nut in these instances, and I think this just describes the irony of human interventions on the rivers. We straighten out the channel, we build on the floodplain, and then we're absolutely surprised and horrified when our houses flood. We've got to get away from this this sort of cycle of stupidity. So what can we do? Well, for a start, we can start to look at the old meanders of rivers. So often when a river is straightened out, it may well be that it's straightened for a mill flood race. So basically to channel water down to the mill wheel, power the mill in a sort of controlled way. But often the original river meanders were then cut off and no longer exist. Well, in places they do, you can still see the remnants of them in the countryside, and you can reconnect them and create new habitat. So that will also allow more water capacity. You can also start planting on the valley sides. Water runs into tree roots. The holes that are created by tree roots absorb 60% more water than running straight off a field. So you can actually start to create a sponge for that water to stay in the environment. It will help us out for our cropping, but it will also stop water running straight down into the river and creating flood risk further downstream. Beavers, I couldn't go without mentioning beavers, really, especially the exciting news that this last couple of weeks we've now been told by government there will be a license to release beavers into the wild. Don't expect it to be happening, here any time soon. There are other counties which have already got projects that are much more suitable, perhaps, than some of what we're doing here. But we do have beavers in the eastern region in enclosures, and they're there for a specific reason. They're there to help with flood risk. So the beavers at Finchingfield have created a huge network of channels on the site. It's all fenced in, but they're actually storing massive quantities of water on that site. They're creating the environment for a biodiversity explosion. We have aquatic insects, we've got freshwater shrimp, water shrews, all sorts of things living on that site now. And the great thing is that although it's making it harder and harder for us to get across the site, this water is being released over the summer. It's combating drought by allowing that stream, which would normally have dried up, to flow all year round. But during the winter, the dams that the beavers have constructed are trapping the water and stopping it flowing as fast into the village downstream. So they're not only combating flooding, but they're combating drought. This is climate resilience at its best. So we can't obviously have scenes like this everywhere, but in certain places, this is absolutely brilliant. This is really working well. We're capturing that water that would not have been in the environment. We can try and do it ourselves, and we do. We put leaky log barriers in some streams where we've got flood risk, and that helps to hold the water up before it gets downstream and disperse some of it before it hits a village. So that's possible. But the other thing we need to start tackling is these barriers to fish migration. We've got 400 of them in Essex alone. There'll be a similar number in Suffolk, no doubt. And we're basically trying to tackle those to allow fish species like eels and brown trout to migrate, but also to provide areas where fish can swim back into if we have a pollution incident like this one we had at Halstead in Essex on the River Cone, where tens of thousands of fish were killed upstream of a mill barrier, but the fish downstream couldn't recolonize the area because they couldn't get past the mill. So we need to remove these barriers to allow fish to actually move upstream when something like this happens as well, and also for them to reach other populations of fish so that they don't end up being genetically inbred You know, they need to be able to move from population to population, even if they're not the sort of fish that go out for mass migrations like eels do. They still need to move up and down our rivers. So brook lamprey are a good example. They need to spawn in upstream gravels, and then they float downstream, and most of their life cycle is in heavy silt, and they're filter feeders. They just sort of poke their heads out of the silts. They need access to all sorts of different habitats. So we're mitigating barriers to allow fish to get back to these areas of shade and low temperature water, as I mentioned earlier on. And the way we can do that is just to, we don't even have to take a barrier out. At Deben Mill, that mill barrier is not being removed anytime soon. That's staying there. But we could bring fish around the edge of it along the old Stratford River, the original river channel of the store, over a weir, and we've converted this weir to be basically a fish pass. If you have a look at this, you'll see there's a similar sort of effect on another weir, where we put in these knobbly little plastic tiles for eels to be able to climb up the weir because they can't get past it normally. And then these oak beams are placed across with little cuts in between, so that they form a series of pools, a bit like steps, watery steps up the ramp, and the fish can swim from one step to another, from one pool to another, and then over the top. So there's a very simple way of getting fish up and downstream. So I'm going to finish there and hand over to David, because we are using our river champion volunteers to do all sorts of sampling in the rivers. This is a group that we're doing eDNA sampling along a river so that we could tell what mammal species were there. But there are fundamentally important things about the water quality that David will now explain in much more detail. So thank you very much for listening to that, and I hope you enjoy David's wonderful talk on what they're doing on the Deben. My local river, by the way. I live on the Deben.
David, I think you're on mute at the moment.
Okay.
Perfect.
Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Okay. How do I advance the slides, Bailey?
Just hover over them and you can click the arrow.
Okay, that's fine. I'll go on to full screen. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. I'm David Findley. I'm part of the Deben Climate Centre. I've been working for the last 3 years in looking at water quality in this river. And I'm going to take you through what we found from when we started 3 years ago and some of the issues that we're facing within the river and what we've been able to get done about it. So I hope this is going to go to the next one. Fine. So the River Deben, some of you will be familiar with it, others not. The river is about 23 miles long. It's a really interesting river in that it has an estuary as well as the river proper. It runs from Debenham in the north all the way down to Bordsea, and as you can see, it changes an enormous amount. The photo in the top left-hand corner is a very small tributary of it. We've got a couple of bridges there. Over on the right, quite interesting, you've got a very small channel. You can probably see the ghastly green weed that's in there. That is a result of an Anglian Water sewage works being the only source of water, because this is normally dry in the summer. We'll talk a bit more about that later. And then the estuary section down at Bordsea with that little post with the gull on the top of it. And over on the left-hand side, this is Martlesham Creek. Some of you may have heard about Martlesham Creek, made famous by Therese Coffey, it was renamed Shit Creek. And that's a particular problem area for the river. So moving on from there. So the river faces two big challenges. In the non-tidal section, it's a pretty stressed ecosystem. As Darren has talked to you about earlier on, there are a lot of challenges for rivers, whether it's mills that block the way, whether it's pollution sources from agriculture or from our sewage works, or by abstraction. And on the Deben, the non-tidal Deben, abstraction is a particularly major challenge. In summer, the river would run dry if it wasn't for actually the Environment Agency and Anglian Water pumping river into it in some of the upper reaches. This study, which is done 3 or 4 years ago now, suggests that we would need to reduce the levels of abstraction by somewhere around 25% to get the river back to where it ought to be. And anybody who know the area will know that the abstraction is both for public supply, but also for farming. Farming, particularly in the Deben, in the sandy areas, would not happen if it wasn't for the major irrigation that goes on. But that creates a big issue for the river. In the tidal section, there's an estuary, and particularly the salt marsh is under threat from pollution and from other water activities that we all do. So there's some particular challenges for the river, and we'll say a little bit more about that later. What are the sources of pollution that we've been studying? There are several. First of all, and probably the most obvious, is the outfall from private cesspits and the like, but probably more importantly, the outfall from sewage treatment works. Sewage treatment works is a bit of a misnomer, because what's essentially happening is that the inflow, the waste from all of ourselves goes into the sewage works. It's a series of filters, and what comes out at the other end certainly doesn't do much to the bacteria. So they empty bacteria into the river, and also are very high in phosphates, as we'll talk about in a minute. Livestock is a major issue in the river, as Darren pointed out from the Constable painting. Poaching by cattle and humans is a big issue. It erodes the bank. And then here's a good example from just down the road from where I live. The cattle actually drink the water in the river. There isn't any water supply in the meadow, and they go in the river and pee and poo in the river. We put our litter and public waste into our rivers. That's a lovely supermarket trolley picture from Framlingham. And then you look at these two pictures on the right. The bottom, the right-hand one, this is what happens when farmers don't have sensible field margins. The water in flood conditions just erodes away the sand. It goes down onto the roads. It goes into the river, and you get silting. On the left-hand side, you'll see a good example where this farmer's almost left no margin at all within the field. And there are very few trees on the right-hand side, and the road's right against it. Look how turbid that ditch is. We've got other photographs where farmers have a 2 or 3 meter margin around the field and plant more trees, and it's completely clear. So you'll see many sources of pollution, and we'll talk a little bit more about those a little later on. So those are some of the things that create the issues. Starting off by looking in more detail at water quality. We started about 3 years ago looking at a whole series of sample points up the river from Martlesham all the way up to Debenham. And we started off by looking at E. coli because it was a particular problem because we have a number of swimming holes and swimming spots. We have people canoeing and kayaking. We have Boy Scouts going in the river. Certainly in the estuary, there are a lot of people who do wild swimming every day. So we started testing the river. We found, particularly where there is Anglian Water sewage works, but also in other areas, we found high levels of E. coli. E. coli is a great marker to tell us what's happening about bacterial pollution. To give you an idea, what we do is we take a sample, a 1 milliliter sample from the river, we put it on a special plate, and we put it in an oven for 40 degrees for 24 hours and count the dots. Anything more than 9 dots, or 900 per 100 milliliters, is unsafe by the judgment of the Environment Agency in both inland waters is less in the sea waters. So you'll see here, this is Ufford, just down the road from me. We have, the river divides into two upstream of here because we've got a mill. So the upper part is what we call the upper hole, and the downstream part is the blue graph. This is where people swim and have swum for hundreds of, well, certainly 50s of years. It was very popular during COVID. And just after COVID, we started to do testing to see what was happening in the water. As you'll see, during the summer, so the left-hand side of this is August and September. The blue part, the lower part, was much, much higher. Why was that? Because the flow rate was very low. It was a hot summer. And essentially what happened is the E. coli bacteria started to almost brew up within the water system. And we got some spikes from low flow in a hot summer. We had to put up notices to say to people, don't swim in here. The orange line, as you can see, is much more stable and generally below the safe limit. But look what happens in the autumn. Thank goodness people don't swim there in the autumn very much. You can see that both the blue and the orange are going up significantly. We were really worried about that and started to talk to Anglian Water. And in fact, the one on the 25th of November, we managed to tie to an actual sewage spill about 5 miles up the river at Wickham Market. What's interesting is you can see even 5 miles down from a spill, you've got really significant levels of E. coli. So that got us really working on what is happening here, what are some of the dynamics, and what can be done about it. This is just to say that at that point, there was a lot of, we started to get some publicity in the media about what was happening in the river. This was partly from the work we were doing, but also from the Save the Deben group, from Surface Against Sewage. So we started to get publicity and more interest from the public. And you'll see there on the right, that's just down the road from me. We put up a sign saying, don't enter the water here. People were still doing so. I had to talk to mums with their kids, and the kids were still jumping in the river. And we do know that I've talked to them, people who've had some pretty nasty infections from both swimming in the river, from also wading in the river to go fishing. More of that about that later. So what we started to do about 2 years ago, just over 2 years ago, was to start to track the river from its source up in Debenham down to the tidal section in Woodbridge. And you can see here the results in August 2023. We had 16 locations, and those the red stars you can see there are the 3 Anglian water sewage works. What's interesting, when you go upstream, for example, to Easton, I don't know whether I can do this, yes I can, there you got 1,000 colonies per 1 milliliter. So that is 100 times the safe bathing limit. Okay, downstream, where Boy Scouts were camping that summer, you've got 53, that's over 5 times the safe bathing limit. Further down the river, you can see the flow rates started to create fewer problems, but we really started to get a bit of a feel for what was happening above and below these major pollution outfalls. I think this should work. So here, just to give you an example, this is a typical picture. The blue dots tell you how many colonies there are of E. coli. So this is Wickham Market. So a typical month, this will be February last year, I think. Upstream, you find 12 dots. That's just over the limit. This is somewhere where people regularly kayak and were swimming. Just over the boundary from where they were doing that, there's the Wickham Market outfall, 400. And about 100 yards downstream, it's still 40. So you're getting some really quite dramatic effects from the outfall. We've also found public, where people have, private outfalls of a similar effect, probably diluted more quickly. So we started to identify that there's some major issues with our sewage system, which, although it's treating the water, the E. coli level coming out is hardly changed from what it is going in. So that's the start of looking at the E. coli picture. More about that in a minute. Phosphates is a big issue, and Darren mentioned earlier on about the pennywort weed. Here's a really good example of what happens when excess phosphates create problems in the river. It leads to something called eutrophication, which means that essentially you get excess weed growth, oxygen starvation, and as Darren said earlier, if the sunlight can't get it down into the river, the fish will die, the other aquatic life will suffer. Here's a really good example from summer 2023 on the left. We basically started to do phosphate checking with this little device. It only costs us about less than £100, and you can start to check what the phosphate levels are. Just to give you an example, our early work suggested that actually, interestingly, again, the hot spots were coming from the Anglian Water sewage works, the black dots there. But even down in Woodbridge, in the tidal section, we were finding the phosphate levels to be well above the natural England 0.1 parts per million guideline. Some of these areas here, you look at this one in Rendlesham, it's still pretty bad. It was 30, which is 300 times the phosphate level. And you can see the downstream effect, all those red dots. So that's basically creating eutrophication, particularly where there's low flow. What we did then about a year ago is we published a report. One of the key things about citizen science is it gets criticized because it's not rigorous enough. It's not scientifically based. I'm fortunate that I was originally had a qualification in chemistry. My next orbit 3 neighbour was a former professor of microbiology. So we've been able to train our volunteers to do the testing in a rigorous way and checked against what Anglian Water and the Environment Agency have been finding. So what are we doing now? We've expanded our activity to look not just at E. coli and nitrates, but also at phosphates and nitrates. And the other thing in greater detail is to look at some of the things that Darren talked about in terms of flow rate, in terms of the way the river is, where it's meandering or where it's fast. We've also started looking at temperature and conductivity and pH to get a much more detailed profile of the environment that the river is creating. And just to give you an example, Bailey, if you can play the broadcast, I just want to give you an example of the kind of work we're doing with our volunteers. Can we play that? Thanks.
Late summer on the River Deben near Woodbridge, and Raya the Labrador needs no encouragement to enjoy the water. But what exactly is she swimming in? It's a question this group of citizen scientists want answered. They're being trained with the support of the Environment Agency to test the river to better understand what's in the water.
Every day we find something different. It's a long river. It's almost 20 miles long in total, so there's an awful lot of different sources. We started off with E. coli because E. coli is very easy and cheap to test for, but now we're spending more money and we're digging deeper to find out what else is in the river that might not be helpful to our health.
These pools here on the River Deben have been used by locals for swimming for decades, but recently, thanks to the work of the citizen scientists, high levels of E. coli have been found in the water, so much so the parish council has on certain days put up notices advising against swimming. But without their data, then anyone using this river would be doing so ignorant of the risks.
Loads of people, they'll all appreciate the Deben, and people want to do water sports and go in the water, but I wouldn't trust any water at the moment, given what we've heard.
It was Paul Whitehouse. He did a programme called Our Troubled Rivers, and it was just absolutely horrifying.
Environment Agency, Natural England, we just haven't got the funds now to be able to do this work, so it's really important that we reach out to members of the public actually that are passionate.
The Deben Citizen Science Programme was launched after recreational use of the river boomed during the pandemic lockdowns, spurred on by campaigning by former pop star Fergal Sharkey and the voting down of an amendment to the Environment Bill that would have stopped water companies dumping raw sewage into rivers and the sea. Scientists say having access to this stream of new data is proving invaluable.
There are a lot of things that go on our rivers that are unseen or unreported, and by getting involved, people can help identify what those risks of pollution and contamination are, so that we can solve those problems for the benefit of all the river users.
The citizen scientists say they'd rather not have to be testing at all, but in the absence of any certainty over water quality, they say taking matters into their own hands is the only sure way to save Suffolk's streams and rivers from the threat of sewage and other pollutants. Russell Hookey, ITV News, Ufford near Woodbridge.
Great. So just moving on from there, I want to say a little bit more about kind of what are we looking for, what are we finding, and how have we extended our work from just testing to looking a little bit deeper about what some of the dangers that we actually face from bathing in the river and from river activities. So one of the things we do is our volunteers, we got about 40 volunteers. We now got 70 sampling points across the river. They're also looking for telltale signs of pollution. You can see here a few examples. Look out for these when you're out in your river. So green algae is definitely a sign. If you see brown colours like this, or you look out for an outfall, those are some of the easy things to spot. Interestingly, the bottom left, you've got foam bubbles. Now, that one actually is an example of a natural bubble that's created from just the flood water going down. There are much more dangerous ones where there's big pollution and you've got an excess, for example, of detergents that are happening. Look out for oily film. We found some of that quite recently in a ditch that had just been cleared, where the machinery had gone onto the woodland by the river and probably discharged some oil into the river. Excess weed growth is a big issue, which is a really good indicator of the eutrophication and which is a real danger. So looking at what we're now finding, you can see there we've got a lot more data and a lot more points. What we're doing essentially is every month, and in the summer more frequently, we're sampling the river on the same day each month, the first Monday of every month, and we sample the river and look in detail at what's going on. You'll see here the difference between October and this month. Quite significantly, that part of last year, there was still relatively low flow at the beginning of October, and the pollution levels were quite a lot higher. You'll see not that many green dots until you come down towards Woodbridge and the tidal section, and the River Lark and the River Finn, which flow off to the left on there, up to Westerfield and beyond. You can see there's quite a high level of pollution there. Those the reds are well over their 45 colonies. So that's 5 times the safe bathing limit. Fortunately, you can see there on the right-hand side that actually Waldringfield, which is a safe bathing spot, was okay. But look at last October. What we found there, only a week after the Environment Agency had stopped testing, was a major pollution incident. Just to give you an idea, here we spotted all these were all from the river, from Melton down to Waldringfield, and a real horror story of E. coli pollution. This was raised with Anglian Water, with the Environment Agency, and followed up to try and actually discover what had happened. The initial feedback was that we'd perhaps had a lot of migrating birds that arrived, but there's no way they could have created that level of pollution. So we really are about challenging through the Environment Agency, the water companies and farmers and others to say, we need to do something about these kind of pollution levels. That was quite a bad incident there. Looking a little bit further up the river at Debenham, it's really a series of small streams that come together to form the river. And certainly in the summer where there's low flow, here's October, but in August, we had points where there was no flow whatsoever. So the E. coli and the pollution doesn't get at all diluted. Come along to February this year, and you can see there's there's hardly any red, and interestingly down at the bottom there, D2 and D1. D2 is where the sewage works is. Dilution was quite strong. One of the things we've been doing in more detail is partnering with the University of Suffolk. You saw Dr. Nick Tucker on the video earlier on. And what we did was, back a couple of years ago, we started to look at what was happening behind the E. coli pollution and looking at toxins. You can see there a series of samples that we took, and that out of 10 samples, there are 6 there that actually have the E. coli has attached to it serious toxins which can be seriously damaging to our health. To give you a little bit more example of what that means, I'm not going to go through all of these, but you can see the second one, Ti-B enterotoxin. That's a secreted toxin. It attacks the intestines and you get dysentery. And we do know that there are at least a couple of cases that ended up in Ipswich Hospital from people who ate fish from Martlesham Creek or bathed in it when they shouldn't have done. These are nasty infections. It's not just E. coli on its own, it's the toxins that attach to it. And the last example there, cytolethal distending toxin, that is very nasty indeed. It actually attacks the host cells of DNA. The cells divide, they distend, they die, and you get a modified version of DNA that creates all sorts of problems for the human body. What we've also done with our colleagues at the University of Suffolk is look at antibiotic resistance. Here is an example of a series of samples that we looked at set against a third generation antibiotic. The more red the line, the more resistance there is. And you'll see on some of those, they're reasonably white, but you can see at least on half a dozen of those, you've got red, which basically means there is serious antibiotic resistance. So what you're starting to find is antibiotic resistance cropping up in the E. coli in the rivers. Why is that happening? Well, the work we've done suggests that part of that is essentially what's happening in some of the treatment works is the amount of bacteria that there are in there allow the E. coli to cross-fertilize and cross-contaminate each other and generate more resistance. That is not helped by having antibiotics in the river as well. We're not testing for those specifically, but those create a big problem. Looking in more detail at phosphates, you'll see here there is a big difference between the July the 1st situation and position this month. You'll see only 3 red dots on the chart on the right. You'll see a lot more on the earlier one. In particular, I'd note the ones over here at Wickham Market and up here. This is Charsfield. There's a little brook. That's the stream I showed you earlier on, where in summer it's dry and the only water is that coming out the sewage works. Here we were finding levels of phosphate 70 times the healthy river level, and at Wickham Market nearly 20. Up in Debenham there was still some very high levels. What's happened is we've spent probably 2 years talking to Anglian Water about phosphate reduction. It's not complicated, it's known technology. So what Anglian Water have done in the last 12 months is they've implemented phosphate stripping. It takes the phosphate out of the water. It's a well-known chemical process using iron sulfate, and you can see that what the Environment Agency have done working with Anglian have implemented permit levels which will have reduced the phosphate level from very high to reasonable. Actually, what's really been interesting, I'll talk about Rendlesham in a minute, is to look at what's happened in Debenham. Here's Debenham. Debenham last August had a phosphate level of nearly between 6 and 7 parts per million. Look at it this month, it's way down below the 0.1. So it's been a very successful campaign to persuade Anglian Water, both the Environment Agency and people like ourselves, that they needed to implement this phosphate stripping. Interestingly, Rendlesham, it hasn't happened yet. It was put back because, in part because Anglian Water were going to do a lagoon biological method, and it didn't happen. They essentially scrapped it, but have now been given till 2027. Our view is that's 2 years too late. Interestingly, they're not implementing it further down the river at Martlesham Creek, and they're not implementing it in some of the tributaries. We continue to put pressure on them to do that. You'll probably all have heard about nitrates, and nitrate is another contaminant which with phosphate creates oxygen depletion, it generates weed growth, and it threatens biodiversity. It is another problem within the river. It comes from all sorts of sources, from agriculture, from nitrogen-based fertilizer, from septic tanks, from sewage works, from animal manure, and it comes out of the atmosphere. Nitrates is quite a significant challenge and much more difficult to get rid of in the river. Just to give you an example, the work we've started doing, you can see here 2 charts, one from last month, one from this month. You'll see anything over the yellow level is borderline. Anything over, excessive, shows that essentially we've got levels that are above the Water Framework Directive guideline. You can see there a very significant number of those are both the green and the blue are well over that. What's great is we're now working with farmers about how you can reduce that. Some of that example I showed you earlier on about getting strips at the edges of fields, that absorbs the nitrates. They don't run off into the river, it's so fast. What's great is there are now ways in which farmers can test the ditches that they're looking after. And that's a really good way of starting to look at nitrogen reduction. So those are some of the things we're doing in terms of testing, the chemical and the bacterial processes that are going on. What we've now started to doing, looking at, and this speaks to something Darren talked about earlier on, is our volunteers are working with the Riverfly Partnership and the Environment Agency to start to survey the river. We've got about 10 or a dozen points on the river now where we're looking every month at what's happening in the river in terms of the invertebrate population. Darren mentioned earlier on mayfly, caddisfly, all of those are really good signals as to how healthy the river is. The more mayfly, the more caddisfly, the more shrimps, the more higher quality of the river. So what we do is using this sampling technique, 3-minute sampling using a net and kick sampling, we then look at what's in the river and count the different species. You'll see top right here, these are mayfly. Over here is a caseless caddis. Down the bottom here are some caddisfly larvae which have managed to find their way into alder cones. So it's a really interesting and fun thing to do. I did 2 surveys on Monday with 3 other people. We managed to do 2 sites in an afternoon. We were able to actually get a really good sense of the quality of the river. So you do a count, you set a benchmark, and what that does is once you've got the benchmark, you can tell if you find a survey where you're well below, the Environment Agency will come and look in more detail. So this is a really good practical way of surveying the river and getting a sense of the invertebrate population that we have. So just to round up, we've got these sites here. Here's the map. We're working with the River Deben Association as well, who have some volunteers who are also doing this. We're intending to expand that map up to Debenham and into some of the other tributaries. So just to wrap up, some of the benefits of what we're doing is the data collection we're doing now is giving us a much more comprehensive picture of the river health, and much more comprehensive picture of what we're doing to the river and what farming and industrial practices are doing to the river, so we can start to monitor and look at hotspots and what's the source of those. It gives us much more knowledge of local pollution sources and also environmental changes. One of the things we were doing during Storm Babette was actually going out there and sampling the river to see what was happening over the week after that happened, to see what had happened to the levels of E. coli. It's a great way of engaging the community. We've started working with a couple of schools now, and actually it's much more about get much more focus on actually putting more emphasis on protection, more emphasis on advocacy, more emphasis on putting pressure on the various players and stakeholders to do more to clean up the river. It's a really good way of actually providing timely and cost-effective quality information on river health. As one of the people on the video said, Natural England, the Environment Agency, they are not doing so much testing. They've had probably 50% of their staff cut over the last 5 to 10 years. So what we're doing as citizen sciences is actually being that labour force to detect pollution, to look at time and escalate it to people like the Environment Agency and to Anglian Water to start to look in more detail at what's going on. So thank you very much for listening. Very happy for Darren and I to take questions.
Wow, thank you both for that. There is quite a few questions, so I'm just gonna smash straight into them. I'll pop them up on the screen as well. So Darren, if you were given all the resources in the world, what would you do to the rivers in the east? So what would be the best case scenario?
Yeah, I think a couple of things that I'd sort out would be the river barriers, getting connectivity back into the river so that species can travel freely up and down. I think connectivity is a big issue for all species, whether they're terrestrial or aquatic. So it's making those links really that's the main thing, but also slowing the flow of water off the catchments and into the rivers is essential, so that we actually start to store more of that water when we've got an excess of it, and release it when we have a drought. So it would be lots of smaller interventions with farmers and landowners to stop water coming straight down the drains and ditches, keeping it in intervention ponds and things like that. I think that those sorts of measures, which are they're actually small measures, but if they're ramped up to large numbers, can make a big difference.
Perfect, thank you. And another one for you, is it best to remove one barrier at a time, or could you remove them all in one go without much negative repercussions? And then along the same lines as that, are there any short-term negative effects of removing the barriers?
Right, so you simply wouldn't ever have the resources to remove them all anyway. So some can be vastly expensive and others can be relatively cheap. When I say relatively cheap, I mean 30 or 40,000 pounds. So these are large sums of money we're talking about. Each barrier is unique, so it will have its own set of challenges, and obviously you have to have the permission of the landowner. The big thing that we have a problem with is not so much necessarily funding some of these barriers, but it's then who looks after them afterwards. Because the Environment Agency will insist on your license that you take full responsibility for the barrier's maintenance in perpetuity, really. And that's something that a wildlife charity can't do. We couldn't maintain 400 barriers forever. So that's one of the issues we really need to start to address. How do we get past that sort of blockage?
Cool.
Oh, yeah, I did ask about negative repercussions. So everyone is fully studied first, just to see whether there will be problems with water levels after the intervention has gone in. So to get your license, you would have to demonstrate clearly that you're not going to have a negative impact. So that would be an important part of the process.
Cool, thank you. This one, obviously, beavers are amazing. I think we're all on the same page about that. But are there any other super significant species for river recovery?
Yeah, I'll say, pretty much what David was talking about is indicator species. So the aquatic insects that indicate when there's a problem are very important. They may seem insignificant and of no interest whatsoever, but actually they're the vital part of that whole ecosystem, and really important that we keep an eye on them. And likewise, the larger indicator species such as otters. David's painted a really bleak picture of some of the inputs into the Deben. Well, imagine if you're an otter, you've got to live in that soup all the time. So we've got the luxury of saying, well, I won't go swimming today, but the otter hasn't. So if you've got healthy populations of those sorts of species, then great. But that's why we collect them all and post-mortem them when they get knocked down, so that we can tell if there's a specific chemical or parasite that's causing them a lot of issues. So yeah, indicator species, I think, rather than necessarily ones that are actively changing the river.
Yeah. Do either of you have a favourite species that live in or around rivers?
David?
Sorry? Yeah.
Favourite species? Well, water voles for me.
Yeah.
The same, David? Water voles?
Yeah, waterfalls. I think I just reinforced the point about otters. Maybe I've painted a very bleak picture, but we do have otters on the River Deben. They're managing, they're breeding. So it isn't all black. I think where I kind of come from is I have a neighbour who was born and raised in around here. And he talks about the river. When I was a young boy, he's about 70 now, the river was teeming with life. And now he looks in it, and there are some fish, but they're not the ones they're not as big, they're not as many. And interestingly, some of the places where we do our river fly surveys, it's pretty dead. We did one yesterday, a couple of days ago. We expected to find a lot there. It's winter, of course, but we found about, I should think, a tenth of the shrimps that we found in August last year. So of course it's winter, but there's an impact of what's going on in the river.
Cool. Next question. So this is from Roger. Hi, Roger. I feel like a radio presenter. Hi, Roger. How do beaver dams enable fish movement, whereas sluices do not?
Yeah. So I mean, basically, you're saying, how is it that I'm railing against an artificial barrier and then asking beavers to build barriers in the rivers as well? One of the things with European beavers, I think we get them kind of mixed up with the Canadian ones that create these massive dams, huge structures. European beavers create very low dams, but they push them sideways across the valley. So they trap water across an area rather than necessarily building a 5-meter high dam in a river. If you've got enough water there for them to feel safe, they won't actually bother to make a dam. So you'll find all the dams are high up in the catchment around the headwaters and smaller streams, where they're creating pools for deep cover, basically, and for them to swim around and float wood around. But in the larger rivers, they don't do that. So you will still have quite a degree of connectivity along the river. And actually, because they're quite leaky, we do see fish ending up in those beaver pools and spawning there, and they become sort of little fish nurseries. So fish are still managing to get in because they're kind of using them like stepping stones. I'm not saying every fish would be able to get past a beaver dam by any means. But when fish are migrating, tends to be the spring when you've got a lot of water coming over the top of them. You will find in Scandinavia some of the best salmon rivers are beaver rivers.
That's interesting. Cool. And then I think we've sort of touched on this one a bit with sort of the licenses and stuff you talked about, but is there any way that people can help at all with removing barriers?
Hugely difficult. Believe me, I have to struggle with it myself, and there's a heck of a lot of licenses that have to be filled out, and hydrological reports and everything. So it really is. It's beyond us as wildlife trust officers. We will scope out the area, come up with our own ideas of what could be done, and then we have to pass it to consultant engineers to work out the rest. So yeah, it is pretty technical, but that doesn't mean that we can't all make people aware of the fact that barriers are an issue, and that we should be supporting landowners who are willing to help us out with this. Just encouraging people to think about their rivers in a slightly different way.
Cool. And I think you're off the hook now, Darren, because the last two are for David, unless any more come through. But this one's for David. How can people check where is safe to swim, or is there not enough data for all rivers?
I think one of the things we've done a lot of work on the Deben, but if you look at rivers around the country, whether it's the Windrush or the Wye, or the rivers down in near Southampton, then there's a lot of data from people like ourselves who are doing citizen science testing. If we think about around here in Suffolk, then the Deben, we've got a lot of data about the Deben. We've also got there is a lot of data about the Blythe, and increasingly about the Waveney. So we're starting to get a much better picture of the river and what's happening. The safe to swim is quite a challenge. My perspective on this is, if there's a designated bathing area. So, for example, on the Deben, Waldringfield has been, after much pressure and been given designated bathing status. It's checked every 2 weeks by the Environment Agency. We check it every month and sometimes more often. And if there is an issue, then people will know about it. I have to say though, we're testing this swimming hole partly because we found that there was a problem. It's a lot of it is about volunteers and mobilizing your local group to do it. Another good example would be, we've got a campsite a little bit further up the river, and a Boy Scout field which is used. So we've got reasonable data on that. I think if you're local and you can find a citizen science group in your area, and you're thinking about doing something, ask the question. So the answer, I think, basically is be careful. Particularly in the estuary, it's likely to be more easier to swim. I would advise, if you're going to swim in the River Deben estuary or any other estuary, swim 2 hours, preferably 2 hours before high tide, up to high tide, and not after 2 hours after. Because essentially what our evidence suggests is that the pollution coming down the river from or into the estuaries it goes out with the outgoing tide. I would say tidal dilution has a massive effect. So even if you've got a polluted river, when the tide comes in, it'll just wash it all away. So that'll be my kind of borrow the long answer, but get alongside your own citizen science group, and if there isn't one, create your own.
Yeah, cool. Last question. Again for David, do you think most Suffolk rivers are in the same state as the Deben, or do you think they're mostly better or worse?
I think the data that's out there and the work that's been done around the UK says that probably 70 to 80% or more of our rivers are polluted. So they're not in a good state. And I don't think there's any Suffolk river that is in a really good state. They're bordering on sort of adequate to poor. One of the things that we are doing, and actually just this week, the contract's been signed with East Suffolk Council, is to expand the work that we're doing and bring together what we're describing as the four rivers. That's the Deben, the Ald, the Orr, the Blythe and the Waveney. So to start bringing groups, the groups that are working on there together to do more collectively to build more standards, to exchange good practice, but more importantly, to start to bring together landowners and other interest groups. I think one of the things I'd say is really good at the moment is that we've got landowner groups, at least 3 or 4 around the Deben, who are now aware of the scale of the problem. Storm Babette helped that in a way. It's a good outcome from that. And the landowners are much more focused on what does it take to make the river into a better state? How do we build more flood resilience? How do we get all farmers to be having margins by the side of their fields, not spraying up to the edge? How do they, so what needs to happen in the farming community? What happens with the water companies? There is a lot more awareness now. So although we were not in a great state, I think there's a lot of positive going forward.
Perfect. Cool. Well, we don't have any more questions, so I guess it's time to wrap it up. But thank you both for joining us for this webinar, and thank you to everyone who's watched, and for those that are catching up as well, because this will be available on YouTube afterwards as well. So yeah, everyone have a lovely evening or weekend or morning or whenever you're watching this. And yeah, we'll see you soon. Bye everyone.
Thank you. Bye.